the speakers today. Whitney Baptiste is an assistant professor of anthropology at UMass. I'm sorry, in some of our advertising she was misrepresented. She is assistant professor of anthropology. She received her PhD in 2004 from the African Diaspora Graduate Program in Anthropology at the University of Texas in Austin. Her work also explores area of symbolism and expression in African diasporic material cultures and gender in the formation of African American culture identities. Dr. Baptiste's research interests include African American history, African and African American expressive and material culture, historical and African diaspora archaeology, and Black feminist theory. She has taught courses in archaeology on the African diaspora, African American material and expressive culture, race in the American Museum, gender in hip-hop culture, and anthropology of slavery. Her first book, Black Feminist Archaeology, will be available in August. Professor Mangaliso is here a professor at the Eisenberg School of Management, where he has served as director of MBA programs and coordinator of the PhD program. His teaching interests are in corporate strategy, organizational theory, international and cross-cultural management, and corporate social responsibility. In 1999, he won the university-wide Distinguished Teaching Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award. He's the author of 2 books, Protests and Prophets, Ubuntu in Global Management, and Strategic Choice Under Uncertainty, as well as numerous articles in scholarly journals, books, and conference proceedings. Internationally, Dr. Mangaliso has served on councils on the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria, and on the board of the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies in South Africa. Dr. Mangaliso is past president and fellow of the Eastern Academy of Management. He is former president of South Africa National Research Foundation. His qualifications include physics and chemistry from South Africa, and an MBA in finance and marketing, and a PhD in strategic management. And finally, Natish Nteta is UMass Assistant Professor of Political Science. He received his PhD at UC Berkeley in Political Science. His field of political and social research includes African American and Latino relations, racial attitudes of new immigrants, African American attitudes towards immigrants, immigrant reform and immigration reform, and racial attitudes in the post-civil rights generation. Professor Nteta has taught courses on race politics, American politics culture, and African American politics. He is a recipient of prestigious fellowships and grants, has published numerous essays and papers, and his essay, Follow the Leader, Elite Messages and Latino Perception of Commonality with African Americans, in the book From Minorities to Majorities, African American and Latino Relations in the 21st Century, has been published last year. Welcome all 3 speakers.
Thank you very much. We are very appreciative of the effort to put this panel together following the exhibit that we all participated. Should I sit down? The exhibit that we participated in at the Final Center only a month or so ago. That was a very moving exhibit, and the stories that are displayed down there. I encourage any of you who have not been down there to take a trip and visit those pictures that David Goldberg put up for us. Today's panel really looks at the question of racism on both sides of the Atlantic and the equator, South Africa and the United States. My fellow panelists, Whitney and Letitia, will be addressing mostly the issues this side of the Atlantic, I guess. I'll be the link down to South Africa in terms of presenting my perspectives there. However, I will also address some of the questions that are pertinent here in the United States based on my experiences here, having lived in this country for a good 29 years this year, so it's been quite a while. Now, the question of racism and race and discrimination comes to the fore when you talk about the story of apartheid, as we saw in the exhibit there. There are so many things, so many questions that come to the surface when you look at it. The first thing that strikes one, and I have to recuse myself by saying first, I'm not schooled in the area of racism and race relations. That's not my field, as you heard. I'm more a scientist, a natural scientist by my upbringing, and got thrown into the whole question of racism by virtue of the way I look, I guess. And you can't avoid it because you become curious why people are behaving the way they do towards you. And then when you look at the mirror, see that, okay, I understand where it comes from. But then those who have defined racism state it as a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacity. So from the skin, from your physiognomy, they infer that the racial differences we have translate to racial superiority and inferiority among those of the various races. And the word racism itself is used to refer to instances in which individuals or group intentionally get targeted for negative treatment on the basis of those physiognomic attributes I spoke about, including things like culture, religion, and other group-based characteristics. Well, when I started to look at this topic, I noticed that the first time it was introduced, it was here in the United States in a formal way that has consequences. What was during the first census in this country, and the basis of which had to do with the whole question of freed slaves and those who, and what participation they would have in the election process. It appears like in the South there was a whole lot of 90% of Black American, African Americans were in the South, and very few were in the North. And the Northerners apparently wanted the freed slaves not to have any vote, and the Southerners wanted them to have a vote. So it was one down in the South, 0 over here, and it ended up being 3/5 was the compromise after a long debate. So a black person was worth 3/5 of a full human being. I have a very interesting, experience with that. Back 20 years ago, I did my PhD here at UMass in the summer of, was it 1987 or something. There were 12 doctoral students in the program, 3 of whom were like me from Africa, and the other 9 were European Americans. There was a scholarship that was support, summer support for the doctoral students. But it turned out that there were 11 of these summer support stipends. So the 9 white students were all given stipends. And we were down to 2 stipends for the 3 African students. So we're told, okay, you'll split the 3 stipends, between the three of you. Until somebody, pulled them by the sleeve and said, wait a minute, do you understand the implications of what you're doing? You're saying that these people are worth 2/3 of what the other students are worth. So our dean at the time went away and found some money elsewhere to give us each a full scholarship. So these things can happen serendipitously, they can happen unintentionally, but the consequences of them are, a lot more hardship among those that look or experience life a little differently. Now there's the issue of institutionalized racism, which I'm sure our panelists may address with a little bit more, articulation than I can do. On a facetious side of things, there was a report given of a conversation in the 1930s to just show you that racism and race, the concept race is a social construction, as Berger and Luckman would say, of a conversation related by Patricia Williams in one of her books about an exchange between a Haitian statesman and an American officer. I'll just reenact this. Okay. American official, what percent of Haiti's population is white? Haitian statesman, 95% white.
The American officer, apparently befuddled in thinking that this guy is mistaken. I don't understand. How on earth do you come up with such a figure, so high? Haitian statesman. Well, how do you measure blackness in the United States? American officer, official. Anyone with a black ancestor is considered black. Haitian statesman. Well, that's exactly how we measure whiteness here in Haiti. Get what I mean? So it's all a social construction. So from this exchange, you can see that it's very interesting how race is classified in the different countries. In South Africa, race was defined as who you look like, anything you look like. If you are white, you're accepted as white, you're white. There are no tests that are made. So you're as white as you're accepted. In the US, you are black if at least 1/16 of your blood or some percentage of your blood is black, however white you may look. And in the example we've just seen, it seems like the reverse is happening in Haiti. That whole thing is just a social construction. But then both societies, South Africa and the United States, were founded on these strong racial undertones that had consequences on large populations. I'll cite you an example that took place in 1953 in South Africa in the process of putting together the education system once apartheid became law. And you want to think about this, that with the background that in 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education was just about to declare, this was in 53, 54, to declare that separate cannot be equal. But in South Africa, they made sure that separation was the case between the education for blacks and whites. And here's the logic that was supplied by Dr. Verwoerd, who was the Minister of Native Affairs in that time. There is no place for the Bantu, that's how they called a black man in South Africa, Bantu, a term that's very stigmatized even today when you come to South Africa. I noticed that my colleagues from the rest of Africa use this term with a great deal of acceptance, particularly anthropologists. But in South Africa, it's a highly stigmatized term. So there is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it didn't say he, when it cannot use it in practice? That is quite absurd. Education must train people in accordance with their opportunities in life, according to the sphere in which they live. This was in South Africa. But if you look back to in time here in the United States, when the whole Confederacy was forming to break away from the Union, a statement was made that says the cornerstone of the new government rests upon the great truth that the black man, they use the word Negro there, is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This is our new government. It's the first and in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This was stated here in the United States. So both in the United States and South Africa, racism can be traced back to the founding of these nations as a debate. But then it became coded into law and later was changed through a lot of struggle. And we know in the United States the Civil War, later the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and the general freedom movement that included bus boycotts, sit-ins, marches, all intended to address the fundamental issues of freedom, respect, and dignity, and of economy inequality. In South Africa, we saw similar struggles with the South African Defiance Campaign in 1952, the Sharpeville riots in 1961, and later the Soweto riots in 1976, and of course the sanctions movement that came here to the United States. Now the question we want to ask in the panel, and of course in the general exhibit, is in today's world, does this racism exist? Sounds like a rhetorical question, really. The main question is, can it be remedied? What are the most effective remedies? What about affirmative action? Or should we go with the color blindness that requires us to try to eliminate it without any reference to it? Well, I must say that having come to the university back in the 80s, I got thrown into a university that was very much immersed in the struggle to fight against apartheid. We were part of the student movement here in the UMass that initiated many campaigns. I don't know how many of you will remember a campaign that was called the Red Ribbon Campaign, where people around the country had red ribbons here. It was initiated by the black students here at the university, in the Students' Union area there. We were called by Dr. Chester Crocker one time in the 80s, 84 it must have been, to come and advise them about what to do with respect to this call for sanctions. This is before the sanctions were passed. We went to Washington, and the response we got from him was so shocking and so heartbreaking, because what he said was, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under Reagan. So he said in response to us, you know, South African blacks can stop apartheid themselves in 1 week if they chose to. The reason they're stopping is they are not really motivated to do it. We asked how. He said, by staying away from work for 1 week. Now, some of us were youngsters when in 1960 the Sharpeville riots happened, and how the police came and just assailed our fathers, brothers, uncles and aunts, and beat them up like kids. Some of them were swollen, some of them had to go to a hospital for staying away from work for just 2 days. People were killed in 1984 when the striking was taking place in the townships of Port Elizabeth. And as you know, in 1976, about 700 kids were killed, most of them on their backs, running away from these bullets that the police were shooting at them with. So his answer was a really deflator for us. It showed that these guys are not determined to help blacks at all against this machinery of apartheid, which is a very interesting turn when you see what's going on with Libya right now, where the interference is taking place, or intervention. Is racism on the rise? The answer to this question is yes. A new study in the Southern Poverty Law Center describes that it's in the rise, and hate groups are coming out very big, and by its count there's now more than 1,000 active extremist groups in the United States. I've prepared some incidents that I could share with you that come from my personal life, but I think that at this point I should stop and just allow my fellow panelists to render, deliver their comments, and perhaps when I'm done with this, I will then, when they are done, I'll come back with my other statements. Before they do, I'd like just to take you to the contemporary South Africa. There was an incident at the University of Free State where a bunch of students, white students, were being asked to integrate their dorms and allow blacks to move in together. But they resisted it, and those of you who are not quite sure about South Africa, the Free State is like the Mecca of apartheid. It used to be where the redneck people resided in South Africa. When I was growing up, blacks were not supposed to walk on certain sides on sidewalks, walk on the street instead. You're not allowed to get food in the restaurants. Oh, that's out of the question. And so here's a residential situation where blacks are being allowed to move in for the first time. And this is the reaction you get. I will just put it up now. Escape here. You can go next. Okay.
This is the student video that has enraged South Africa. Black cleaners apparently believing they're taking part in some game show style antics, throwing up a disgusting stew. What they can't have known is how the video would be presented and what was really in the stew. The Rights residence, now the scene of angry protests, is a student hall of the Free State University. Until recently all white, it has been forced to integrate. The video appears to be a racist protest against that. At the start of it, one of the students is heard saying, "The Boers lived happily in rights until the day that the previously disadvantaged discovered the word integration in a dictionary. Rights was then forced to integrate, and we started our own selection process." mock integration process then follows. The cleaners are persuaded to play rugby, then to race one another, the mocking music added later. They're taken to a student bar to don drinks, and then the students concoct their stew. They throw in a load of garlic, perhaps to mask what they're going to do next. At the end of the video, one of the cleaners wins a prize. There have been protest marches at the university, and today the authorities said they were taking criminal action against the 4 students. The cleaners have been offered counselling.
We are 13 years in democracy and we don't have a place for such kind of people. Otherwise they should leave the country this point.
The media is reporting it as a throwback to the apartheid years.
14 years have gone. We all must come together. We can't have this barbaric, the way people are going on. It's terrible.
They should go to jail because obviously they don't know what it is to really pay for something that you've done. Because all this time that black people have had to suffer, they don't know anything about suffering.
After years of increasing numbers of South Africans believing that race relations were improving, peaking at 68% in 2003, the trend is now the other way. By last year, the figure had dropped to 57% of adult South Africans of all races. 14 years after the end of apartheid, this is how the ideal of racial integration is regarded in one part of South African society. The video ends with a caption. That, at the end of the day, it says, is what we think of integration.
Well, with that, we will ask Tisha to be next. Okay. Put up the PowerPoint slide.
Thanks. So while that's getting up, I'd like to thank everyone associated with the University Museum and the exhibition for inviting me, as well as my fellow panelists, to the interesting panel on race relations in the United States. I'm not a scholar of South African politics or race relations per se, but I have a personal history with the nation. My father, both my parents actually are from South Africa. My father moved to the United States in the 1960s, was one of the co-founders of the ANC branch in Boston, and he worked his entire life against the apartheid state, both in the United States and in South Africa. So based upon this upbringing, one of my scholarly interests has been race relations generally, but more specifically here in the United States. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a general picture of how race is lived in the United States, but with the focus primarily on the dominant story, at least what public opinion scholars see as the dominant story regarding race relations in the 20th century, which in essence was the change in white racial attitudes towards African Americans and minorities in general. So the 20th century, again, the story of the 20th century is the sort of sea change in white racial attitudes regarding African Americans, from widespread support for notions of the biological inferiority of minorities, in particular African Americans, to the widespread support for racial equality. So as you see in this slide, this is one of many questions that have been asked over time of white Americans. Do you think white students and black students should go to the same schools or separate schools? And our NROC from 1942 to 1995, you see this intersecting sort of example of public opinion, a decrease in support for segregation based in large part on notions of biological inferiority, for support for notions of racial equality between the groups. It's a story most of us in this room know. All right, so I can hit the next one. We also see changes in the perceptions of African American inferiority, right? The story isn't as drastic, right? But in 1977, you have about 30% of whites believing in the inherent inferiority of African Americans. That number today is less than 5%, right? So again, you see this change in white racial attitudes. So these changes in white racial attitudes have led a number of political pundits, a number of conservative scholars to argue that we have engaged in, or at least come to, what is known as a post-racial period of racial development. Right? This is reflective of these racial attitudes, but of course of the election of the first black or African American, or some would argue multiracial president, right? So we've come to a point of America which sort of reflects Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, right? So individuals are no longer what's the word I'm looking for? Judged, excuse me, by the content, by their skin color, but the content of their character, right? So the sort of key aspects of the I Have a Dream speech, individuals have argued that the United States, based on this evidence regarding racial attitudes and based on the election of the first black president, have reached this post-racial period of development. What that period of development is still in question, but people have been bandying about this particular concept. So the question is, have we reached this period of racial development? Have we reached a post-racial America, an America in which, in large part, racism is a thing of the past, something we look in our history books at, right, rather than experience on a daily basis? So in thinking about how to understand whether or not we've achieved this post-racial period of development, we can also look to the literature on white racial attitudes. And this is sort of the more things change, the more things stay the same. However, we see, on the one hand, widespread support for racial equality, but on the other hand, amongst whites, we see continued stereotyping of African Americans. It's the first thing you see. So this slide is from the 2008 National Election Study. And what we see here amongst whites, a majority of whites, 66%, believe that African Americans are poor rather than rich, right? Almost a quarter of whites believe that African Americans are unintelligent. 40% believe that they're welfare dependent, and as you can go see regarding the slide, right, almost the majority believes that African Americans are tied up with drugs and gangs, and a quarter believes that they're hard to get along with. So the idea here is that although we see evidence that whites increasingly embrace notions of racial equality relative to notions of biological inferiority, the stereotypes that reflected the past race relations in the United States still have quite a bunch of power. Next slide, please. You also see widespread support for discrimination, or at least you see a distinction between African Americans and white Americans in terms of the perceptions and the salience of discrimination, right? So this is, I believe, a 2007 Pew study survey, which asked a simple question: how often do you think blacks are discriminated against, right? And then you see a number of social interactions, right? So the story of this slide is a pretty simple one, right? Whites tend not to believe that discrimination has an adverse impact on the life chances of African Americans, whereas African Americans, the victims usually of racial discrimination, do, right? So in thinking again, have we reached this post-racial period, we still see some evidence that that might not be necessarily the case. So that's one way of measuring it, right, in terms of attitudes towards race relations. A different way of measuring it is in terms of behaviors, right? We study attitudes, we study opinions in large part because we have this assumption that attitudes and opinions will predict subsequent behavior, right? So if we have reached a post-racial period of development, we should see high levels of interactions between African Americans and whites, right? So let's see, is that the case? So if you look at residential segregation statistics, and this is from the 2000 census, right? But the story for the most part remains the same. So regardless of which way you want to measure racial segregation, African Americans are the most segregated group in the United States, residentially, right, relative to other minority groups, Latinos and Asians. I mean, the argument could be said that Native Americans are, right, but that is clear because the majority of Native Americans actually live on reservations, right? But for the groups who are said to be integrated within society, you see that African Americans on both measures of racial segregation are the most segregated group. That's one measure of behavior. Well, let's see another. In terms of racial intermarriage, right? This is one of the key measures of integration, one of the key measures of interaction, of course. So we can see here, this is racial intermarriage with whites, right, from the 2000 census as well. And again, relative to other minority groups, African Americans remain, in large part, the most segregated group when it comes to marriage partners. And a third measure is the sort of key aspect of this change in racial attitudes was focused on notions of schooling, right? And the interactions that occur from schools, the notion that through contact you can undermine negative perceptions of outgroups, right? And create this sort of egalitarian society. But recent surveys of the composition, the racial composition of schools, find that the average student, the average white student, attends predominantly white schools, right? The average African-American student attends predominantly African-American schools. The same is true for Latino students, right? And for Asian and Native American small populations, right, they tend to attend plurality white schools. But in terms of the two groups who are historically seen as on or at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, we see this distinction, right, in terms of levels of segregation. So these are ways in which, again, you can indicate that maybe we haven't reached this post-racial United States. Next slide. Another, in terms of understanding the continued salience of race in the United States, is to say, all right, well, if we want to create an egalitarian society, what means should we sort of pursue? Right? And one way to look at it is just to look at support for affirmative action. The policy initiated by white elites in the 1970s, Richard Nixon, right, to create some level of equality, right? So just looking at support for affirmative action this is amongst whites. From 1984 to 2006, we see that support for affirmative action policies, hiring and promoting, right, in employment are relatively low. African Americans are at around 70%. For whites, it's under 15%, right? And that's over time. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to paint a pessimistic picture. This is just the realistic picture, right? So finally, again, in thinking about whether or not we've achieved this post-racial nation, we still see distinctions on a number of measures of economic well-being. On home ownership rates, on poverty rates, on children living under the poverty line, on unemployment rates in 2007. And by the way, these unemployment rates have increased, of course, with our recession. You see that African Americans relative to whites are doing much worse. So, health outcomes is the same story. Infant mortality per 1,000 births, 14 African American children die relative to 6 white children. Life expectancy for men and women are much lower for African Americans than whites. And finally, in what is gaining much traction in popular understandings of the African American community, as well as scholarly understandings, is the increase in incarceration rates amongst African Americans, right? 66% of whites make up 66% of the United States in 2006. African Americans made up 12. However, African Americans make up 40% of the prison population relative to 36% of whites. Right? So again, the idea here of whether or not we have achieved this post-racial America is still in question. Right? We have a black president, but things haven't necessarily come to some level of equality. So again, have we achieved a post-racial America? Right? So again, in the aftermath of Obama's election, people said yes. Right? So how do people view? How is it that Americans generally view whether or not we've achieved this post-racial United States? Right? So the tipping point of this post-racial America was the election of Barack Obama. So 2009 and 2010 CNN poll asked a simple question, thinking about the effect of Barack Obama on relations between blacks and whites in this country. Do you think his presidency has started a new era of better race relations, some improvement, real change, et cetera, right? The story here is that Americans generally are more pessimistic regarding race relations than they were in the aftermath of the Obama race, right? And this, again, is further evidence that maybe we have not necessarily reached this level of equality. Next slide. So in just thinking about the role of race in politics generally, right, the real focus in much rhetoric today is on the Tea Party movement, right? And questions whether or not the Tea Party movement, their criticism of the president, which in public sort of rhetoric is based on limited government, right? And notions that the federal government is encroaching on individual rights, is acting socialist, et cetera, right? A number of people have argued that this criticism has a racial component, right? So former President Jimmy Carter said in the summer of 2008, I believe, quote, "I think an overwhelming portion of the intensely demonstrated animosity towards President Obama is based on the fact that he is a black man, that he is African American," right? So the question is out there. Given that this is, in large part, the movement against, or at least one of the leading movements against the president, and some would argue against minority interests, is this movement influenced by racial attitudes? So we see a number, in terms of the rhetoric of the Tea Party movement, some interesting ways of framing their particular political perspective. So there's a lot of talk of taking our country back. And I always ask my students, well, who are we taking the country back from? Right? And so there's a perception, at least some would argue, that at the heart of the Tea Party movement is this notion that our country, our, meaning white Americans' country, has been taken, right, by minorities and African Americans in particular. And so it's always important to look at the specific rhetoric of these political elite groups. So the question becomes, is the movement in large part or in even small part influenced by racial attitudes? So there's some increasing work which tries to attempt to see whether or not there's a link between Tea Party membership, or at least identification, and racial attitudes. So the 2010 multi-state survey on race and politics asked a question: do you approve of the Tea Party movement, or do you strongly disapprove? And what we see here is that whites' views of African Americans, right, whites who strongly approve of the Tea Party movement, have less positive views of African Americans than whites who strongly disapprove of the Tea Party movement. And so this is initial evidence that race may be playing a role in understanding the opposition to Barack Obama, and in large part, some would argue, to minorities. So again, the question is still out there. Have we reached a post-racial America, right? The first thing to say is, you know, my 5-minute discussion here is really focused on African Americans and whites. Of course, given changing racial demographics, we can't necessarily simply focus on this black-white paradigm. We should open it up to understandings of Latinos and Asian Americans and Native American interests. But in understanding the salience of race, historically, we have focused on the black-white paradigm, and I did so today. But in thinking about whether or not we have achieved a post-racial period of development, I would say we have not. That doesn't mean that we have not achieved quite a bit in terms of living up to the supposed ideals of the founders, right? But I think race remains a key division, or a key factor in understanding the dynamics of American politics as well as personal relationships, right? So again, it's undeniable we're further along the road. We're the steady march towards equality, as some have argued, right? We're at the sort of furthest point in our history, but we still have a long way to go. And my work is studying this progress, studying this movement towards this true egalitarian society.
Well, thank you very much, Tatisha. And Whitney will wrap it up by making a few comments. Just on a procedural question, how much time do we have until?
Since we started so much later, I think we would like to extend this a little bit.
Okay.
And give definitely Whitney the time that she deserves, and then the conversation afterwards if there's an option.
Great, thank you. All right, so take your time.
Thank you. I have a cold, so bear with me. That's why I don't mind being the last person to wrap it up. I'd like to actually start my little presentation with 3 stories that I feel are related to these larger issues and questions. I was born and raised in New York City, and I grew up at a time when I can actively remember this amorphous thing called apartheid that came into my life by the means of grocery shopping, going to gas stations, et cetera, and let me explain. Every month, my mother would receive this huge docket of companies who were invested in South Africa. things that we could not purchase, things that she would not allow in the house, things that I could not buy. I was in high school at this time. It's a very difficult thing when everyone is wearing a particular brand called Reebok, and you cannot buy Reeboks. And somehow I actually got a pair, and I would have to sneak them and wear them and put them on before I got into school. But that was my own form of rebellion against this. So I was coming of age at a moment when apartheid was a very real part of the conversation in my household. It was a part of the conversation in my community. It was a part of the conversation among people who didn't know about it. It was a way to bring awareness to our global Africanness and to talk about ways that African Americans should acknowledge a connection and acknowledge a form of economic power and economic connection that we could actually make a difference. And so that was kind of the first ways that apartheid affected me, that I felt affected me. My argument with my mother as a teenager was how not buying something is going to help people in South Africa. I don't really see the connection. Well, if one person did it and 5 people did it and 1 million people do it, then it does affect the ways in which things are happening in South Africa. The second story related to that is after high school, I went away to a historically black college in Virginia. And we were still very engaged as students about the fact that our university was invested in things that had to do with South Africa. So although I would probably never have admitted it to my mother at that moment, I was in the forefront of student protests and being upset because I felt that I had been fighting apartheid for years now and all these other people were new to it. So then I came into it that way and continued to see it as a part of my identity, a part of the way in which I positioned myself in this world. So the last part of the 3-part story is that I teach a course, Gender and Hip Hop Culture, which concentrates clearly, I'm from the Bronx, so of course, and that's where hip hop began, so of course I start there. But the last unit that we really get into is about the social movement that is hip hop in Africa, and whether that be in Tanzania, whether that be in places like Kenya and Tanzania, where artists are rhyming in their own languages as a form to bring awareness back to their languages and take the power away from English, and to use hip hop as a means of movement, as a means of communicating not only with young people within countries, but young people across the continent who are also in struggle. And that has been very much exploded by things like Twitter and Facebook, which we saw very actively in places like Egypt and Tunisia. So when I had a unit that I was talking about, a lecture set up, slides, music, everything, about hip-hop music from the apartheid era, and then hip-hop music post-apartheid, and I was talking about this. Out of 44 students in my class, only 2 knew what apartheid was. And now that was, 2 things happened at this moment. One, I realized that I clearly am getting older. Number 2 is I realized that why is this not a part of your identity as Americans? Or it's not just about students of color, it's about this very real thing that happened that was of global importance. It wasn't just about one small place, which I don't think of South Africa as a small place. And it just was so shocking to me that I had to go back, and then I didn't know what to do at that point. So we talked about what it was, that entire 50 minutes that I had, because I could not believe that apartheid was not a real part of education. And then we also talked about Jim Crow in the South and segregation, which was, they kind of knew about, but when I related it to apartheid, that word apartheid is never used to relate to the legally sanctioned types of segregation that happened in the South. And growing up in New York City, I am a New Yorker, but my grandparents were from North Carolina. So although they were in the Bronx, when you walked past their threshold, you were basically in North Carolina. So I learned what it was to grow up in a time when segregation was something that I could not relate to. But my grandmother had telling me stories about growing up in a school system where everyone from that neighborhood was in that school no matter what age, because that was the only school available. Your books are the books that were handed down from white institutions that didn't need them anymore. Your school year was 3 months shorter because you had to pick tobacco and cotton. These are the kinds of things that was happening in a place, North Carolina, which is a drive away. And I was trying to relate these kinds of things to my students and realizing that it was so foreign and so unrelated that it was something that and then as we began to talk about it more and talk about the power of post-apartheid hip hop and how it opened it up to Black South Africans singing, rhyming and singing in their own language, as well as moving it away from apartheid era hip hop, which was really the quote unquote colored population and some white. And then there are some hip hop artists now that are a little bit, that are Afrikaner, that are claiming this larger South Africa, which is very problematic, and we kind of got it. We were able to get into that after they figured out what apartheid was, and then relating it to segregation. The work that I engage in and the work that I do is, in some part, some of the reasons why I do it is because of the way I was oriented to understanding the realities of being of African descent in this country. It's not as simple, even though I grew up in New York, when I left New York and came back, I realized that New York was just as racist as any other place in the South. And that was something that, as growing up in the North, you really don't expect that there are forms of subtle, subliminal, institutional, we can go on with lovely adjectives about that involve segregation and racism in ways that are very real, and to a certain extent, the generation that we're engaging in terms of our undergraduates don't necessarily see it as a part of their lives. They don't see, because when you use the word racist, it usually ends the conversation. Because racist is a very, it's a very complex term that often cuts off the lines of communication about what that means to be racist. How is it racist? How am I racist? And if I say the wrong thing, am I racist? So I choose not to talk about it. So we elect Barack Obama, post-racial, we're good. The dream has been fulfilled. Not only is he a black man, but he's African. You know, I mean, that's, you know, so then we question I've heard in even the African-American media questioning his blackness because he spent too much time in white America as opposed to black America. What does that mean? And so when I discuss now with my students about race, as an anthropologist, we all tote over and over again that race is a social construct. Race is not real, race is not biological, but anthropologists also need to admit that the effects of racism is very real. So just because you say it's social doesn't mean that it eliminates the power of it. It also doesn't mean that it eliminates the history of it, i.e. Jim Crow / apartheid in the United States, as well as apartheid in places like South Africa. And so what I've been relating to my students of late is talking about the process of racialization and how all of we are all, as a global community, members of this thing we call racialization. Racialization means that you are defined within your community, but you are also in many ways defined from without. And that also hopefully can bear and share responsibilities about how people live amongst each other, with each other, and learn from each other, but it also does not negate the ideal or the idea that race is in some ways a means of separation, a means of diversion from the reality of attitudes that white Americans tend to have about Black Americans that would actually admit it, that they think. Been relating to my students of late is talking about the process of racialization and how we are all, as a global community, members of this thing we call racialization. Racialization means that you are defined within your community, but you are also in many ways defined from without. And that also hopefully can bear and share responsibilities about how people live amongst each other, with each other, and learn from each other, but it also does not negate the ideal or the idea that race is in some ways a means of separation, a means of diversion from the reality of attitudes that white Americans tend to have about Black Americans that would actually admit it, that they think there's difference, but the marked difference is, it's not really marked. What we did a lot of time talking about in my graduate training was not about racism itself, not biological racism, but something called cultural racism, and a way in which to separate people based on, it's not necessarily their race. It's just something different about what they do and how they live. I could put Muslim in here, and the ways in which they differ from our ideas, the ways in which they differ from the way we see the world. And all of these, it's racialization on a lot of levels. So that's how I've been relaying this whole thing. And I think a part of my re-entry into thinking about apartheid in the United States, way before Eva asked me to be on this panel, was because of that moment, because that moment happened last spring where my students had not heard of apartheid. And it was a scary moment on a lot of levels, because I think that there are lessons in knowing about apartheid and understanding the progression and what's happening in South Africa today, and then what's happening here. And the kind of rhetoric that, if you follow political news, the kind of rhetoric around our president, the kind of rhetoric around the administration, the kind of rhetoric is masked in this form of cultural racism that's very real and very segregating and very separating. So with all of those stories and all of that, I hope that wrapped up a little bit, and then open it up for continued discussion or questions.
Thank you. You're recognized. We'll open up to discussion and sharing of views, and if there are any questions. We don't profess to be experts in this field. I think experts are sitting in those chairs there as well. So please.
One of the most staggering statistics I've ever read was from Tim Wise book. Just looking at the DOJ arrest records, it said that a white person is 48, or a Black person is 48 more times likely to get their first-time drug offense than a white person. So I just want to know what Pam thinks about the war on drugs and its racial implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that the racial aspects of the war on drugs have increasingly become more salient. That with the change in the sentencing regarding things like this sentencing with cocaine and crack, right, powder versus crack, I think people are recognizing that there is a racial undertone to a number of the policies of the war on drugs, and that our war on drugs began in large part in the 1980s when we had a racially conservative president, right, who came to office And so I think, my hope is that people are beginning to recognize that there is a racial implication to a number of policies that emanated from this period of time, and that decision is the first step. But again, it's a slow march. It's a steady march to a point where race is not such a key indicator in terms of life chances, and in particular when it comes to things like criminal policy.
Just to add on this, you mentioned the statistics about the incarceration rate of young black men versus white men. I heard or I read somewhere a statistic that baffled me, using the numbers you used, but what they did was to divide it up to the period up to 1960.
Yeah.
And the period since 1960, 30 years later, in the 90s. Yeah. And the numbers flipped, because prior to 1960, the number of whites, percentage-wise, were higher incarcerated than 30 years later. It flipped around and it ends up being blacks. The question is, why has that happened? And the answer is, once the civil rights laws were enacted that allowed people freedom of movement and freedom of choice and protected their individual rights, now another measure had to be put in place that puts minority people under check. Because in the old days, it used to be the Jim Crow laws and everything, you got to be separate. Keep them bottled in the Bronx, don't let them close to New York or Manhattan and that sort of thing. But once the civil rights laws were passed, something had to be done. And it's said that the policing became even more vicious, more capricious in picking on black young people. And you read all over the place. We have experienced it. I experienced it. I go to we used to have a shop called Steiger's here in the mall, at the risk of, revealing my age here. Steiger's at this mall, and they have some. I walk around trying to shop, and somebody comes next to me and says, "Can I help you, sir?" Yeah, right, but how come you're not helping that other person? I mean, it's like, I've become so sensitive to this that...
You just go to Hastings, you don't have to go back that far.
Right, it happens. They want to police what you're doing, they think you're going to steal. Now, it happened to me in Dublin, Ireland. I want to tell you that how it distorts your personality. On a morning that was very busy in the stores, I was looking for like a sweater to buy for my wife. I was very busy, so I kind of worked my way in. And then after a while, I said, let me try 2 or 3 other stores. I walked out. There was a cop who was standing there. And then after like 20 minutes of this busy morning, I come back to the store, work my way through, and the cop says to me, "Oh, sir, you're back soon." I looked at him and said, "Have you been watching after me or checking if I'm going to steal?" I was angry. And he smiled and he politely says, "Sir, you kind of stand out here." And I looked around, okay, it's all white people. I'm the only black. He didn't have any intentions to single me out for racism, but because I was different, and I'd forgotten that, because you don't see any other black, you think you all look the same with them, well, when you're not. So it changes the personality. It causes you to act in ways maybe being overly defensive, maybe overly aggressive, and that causes the other person, the law enforcement people, to be more forceful back to you, and the spiral goes on, and the incarceration rate rises. And that's one of the things that your question seems to trigger in my mind.
But also there's a business in the prison industrial complex. So you need to keep it populated. How do you keep it populated? You keep it populated by the fact that I don't think I know any black male that has crossed the path of law enforcement. Whether it has gone into court or not, there's still a sense of, in some ways, expectations of harassment because of the ways in which black males, their gender and their race, is seen as a means of heightened awareness for law enforcement. And that's a lived reality. It's something that I think about raising a son, although my husband's from Brooklyn and has experienced it outside of Brooklyn and within, but how do I think about raising a black male in Amherst doesn't mean that he's gonna ever, if he leaves Amherst, even in Amherst, you know, but if he leaves Amherst, I have to be aware that there are certain things, certain conversations that I have to have with my child about interactions with law enforcement. Unfortunately, you know, integration, post-integration is when movements like the Black Power Party, well, Black Panther Party and Black Power movement came into. There were a lot of people who were disillusioned by the ineffectiveness of the civil rights movement. Okay, so now separate is not equal. Now we're integrated. Now what? And so you have people like me that were born in the 70s and just around nothing but Black nationalism. And what Black nationalism represented was, okay, you gave us equal rights, but we're still living, we're underemployed, our housing is terrible, and everybody's getting arrested. How do you know, deal with this in ways that are productive? And how do you find a means to feed your family that's always legal? So it's not a blame, I'm not doing the blame game, but I am talking about the reciprocal nature of institutional racism, but also keeping that prison industrial complex running and giving people jobs. Like upstate New York, that the biggest industry in upstate New York are prisons. And when you shut a prison down, a lot of people are out of work and a lot of people suffer because, so it's integrated in ways that are very much hard to separate out and say that it's one thing or another.
But what's interesting is that you see movements of conservatives and African American civil rights groups in the period of the recession and the sort of new depression beginning to look at this prison industrial complex and the budget of these prisons and recognizing a way to come to some level of balance in our budgets is to deal with this issue, right? So I think over the next few decades, I think people are really going to start looking not based on a sort of civil rights perspective, but based on a financial perspective at this industry and whether or not it's something that we as a nation should continue along this particular path.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned the question of disparity in demographic data for incarceration before and after 1960. Because, you know, another dimension which is understudied in that disparity is the long recession of the 1950s, which was a catalyst in many ways for the increasing rates of Black incarceration, particularly because when you look at the 60s,
Southern Democrats used the prison industrial complex or created the prison industrial complex as a means of subjugation. So this is not just the sort of, you know, you hearsay. There's actual evidence that this occurred. And what's interesting, and a lot of work in political science is looking at this, is the impact of either being a part of this complex or having someone in your family as a part of this complex. So having the experience of being in prison or knowing someone or, you know, living with someone who was in prison has a detrimental effect on engagement in politics, a detrimental effect in turnout, trust in government, all the sort of mechanisms which lead to actual participation, right? So we're creating a generation of African Americans who do not believe in the system, right? And what does that mean in terms of representation, right? You can imagine the generation is not going to feel represented, and that then funnels itself into, in large part, sort of negative consequences of living in a particular community. So I think there's a lot of scholarship to be done here. I think there's a lot of work on the ground to hopefully change the ways in which the system operates.
More questions, comments?
I would just add to that that even if they believe in the system, if they've been to jail, they can't vote.
That's the other issue, right? So that's like,
it's not like they have a choice.
Yeah, so that's, yeah, I mean, that's the gist of the scholarship has been, but what's interesting is that that has an effect on a person's family, right? And so it's not just the person who has that experience, but everyone associated with them. And that's the interesting connection. Go ahead.
A story about the lecture hall full of kids who don't know about apartheid is sort of disturbing and shows all the holes in public school curriculum. And I'm wondering what your opinions are on Black History Month. You know, as a public school teacher, I kind of go back and forth. Does Black History Month do, you know, kind of, is it more beneficial to kind of fill in those, you know, huge holes in the curriculum, or does it kind of just increase this separateness, you know, of history and arts?
You want to start with that one? I can only say that, you know, in a very interesting way, Black History Month being 1/12 of the year means that 11 months are White History Months, right? So why can the Black History Month tradition continue throughout instead of being halted in February? That's all. But you know, having said that, I think it's a good start to have that and raise the consciousness. But I thought that, you know, I would love to see that curriculum, all the activities that are concentrated just in that 1 month, you spread out throughout the year, and more of them being done right through the summer. Because I mean, all these issues we're talking about are daily issues. They don't want to wait 11 months before they can be raised to the surface of the thinking of the collective of America. At least that's the initial thoughts to it.
I always thought Black History Month assumes that Black history is not a part of American history, and that the creation, I mean, and I don't necessarily know the history of the creation of the month, but the creation of Black history, as you said, indicates some level of separateness. Whereas if you read a way to read American history is the sort of intermingling of race with the development of the nation, right? So beginning with the notion that in the Constitution, Black people were 3/5 of a person. The Civil War, the bloodiest war in the history of the United States, is in large part based on notions of race. The largest social movement in the history of the United States was based on race. So I think, and clearly I think public schools are doing a better job of this, of integrating that notion, those sort of stories into the curriculum. But, you know, at the end of the day, without Black History Month, given the constraints that public schools have, a lot of these issues would not be talked about. So, you know, for now it seems like an event, a month, which has its benefits, but in the future, I would like to see that story be told in a more extensive fashion.
Well, I don't know. I'm back and forth about it because it started out as Black History Week from Carter G. Woodson, and I'm back and forth about it because I do believe it's a form of segregating. I do believe it's a way to isolate and try to cover a lot of stuff that should be in many ways integrated. I mean, for me, I can't think of Jamestown without thinking in 1619, 7 people walked off a ship and they were not enslaved, but they were African. And so that's how I think about it, but I didn't necessarily learn that in school. And so the ways in which I was able to learn about a lot of these details was because, again, my mother and my community reinforced the kinds of lessons that they felt, as my mother would call it, it was a debriefing, because school is one thing and then I'm going to teach you everything else. But every parent doesn't have access to that. Every teacher doesn't have access to that. So I think that, you know, there's Women's History Month, there's Latino History Month, there's Native American, I mean, everyone to some extent, not everyone, there's only 12 months, but there's many ways in which things are trying to be highlighted. So the highlighting part of it is a good effort, but at the same time, there's also, to me, there should be a push to kind of try to figure out textbooks and how can textbooks not concentrate on, you know, the superstars like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, Barack Obama. I mean, you know, we need to move beyond, we need to move toward every kind of everyday issues. But then when my class this semester, we had a back and forth because we're like, well, how much, well, when do you learn about race? And when you shouldn't learn about slavery too soon, because the atrocities of slavery and the brutality of it, if you're too young, it's too much. And then my answer back was, well, if you're racialized in certain ways, you don't have a choice of when you learn about race or when you learn about a history that's kind of painful. The first time you come home and say, Mommy, why did they call me this? Or why am I different from this? And so those kinds of realities of how some people are learning mainstream history and then learning by lived experience difference. And then when does the school curriculum catch up with those children learning about difference? So for me, the Black History Month is a double-edged sword. It's a good and a not so good.
Go ahead, Jose.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm a historian, so yeah, I have a special take on this issue. One, you just all of you hit on the real problem. The real problem is that historians and social scientists look at the problem using wrong telescope. It's not race. It's about white supremacy. It's a question of power. Right? And precisely because we use the wrong words to describe the experience and the phenomenon, we get things twisted. There was an interesting interview in the Financial Times this past weekend with Robert Crow, who, from the vantage point of the present government in England now, is the devil incarnate. He's the General Secretary of the trade union, the transport unions in Great Britain. And so there was an interesting question about what he learned, how did he learn, because his children are all Oxbridge Downs now. So they asked him, well, how did you learn what you did as a child? He said, look, my father's a doctor. He said, when at the very young age, my father gave me 2 newspapers. He gave me the Financial Times and the British Communist Party Morning Star. He said, read these 2 papers every day and disbelieve most of what you read in the pink paper. So you know, when we talk about these questions, that ultimately the textbooks won't get changed until there's a change in the relations of power. You know, so.
Actually, that's a very interesting point, because going through my mind as we wind down was to ask the question, what can be done? Well, what should be done in order to move this issue forward? And based on what the commentators had said, that, you know, it's supposed to be a post-racial society, but we're still, you know, submerged, immersed in that whole old racist kind of way of relating to one another. So in trying to answer that question based on the Black History Month, for example, I would say that schools should take it upon themselves, or teachers, people like yourselves, to just continue delivering the stuff that's being delivered during Black History Month throughout somehow. Maybe not initially sanctioned by the powers that be, because they always resist until there's a movement coming through as seen in the 1960s. If that movement hadn't happened, perhaps none of these changes would have happened. So they need to take an initiative and just override everything else. There's a tendency sometimes to kind of pull out of the system. I for example, I was born a year after Apartheid won the election in South Africa in 1948. And so I'm truly one of the children of Apartheid who got the full-blown version of Apartheid by the time I went to school. Now, there were great teachers in the 40s who were trained in the British tradition of the best education ever for anyone. Come Apartheid, many of these teachers decided to throw their arms up and say, we're leaving teaching. We're not going to be feeding kids with this poison. Which I thought maybe it was a mistaken mistaken strategy. I respect Archbishop Tutu very much. He was one of those teachers who left teaching. And we were left to be taught by a second stream group of teachers. And so when you look at Africans of my generation, I mean, Chris, can testify to this, your father. We were taught by people who were so bad at times that the product of our generation was really not as good, educationally. In fact, fulfilling the dreams that Ruth had, that there's no equality between these races. Blacks are wired in terms of their genetic wiring poorly by God, and so they're inferior group of people. But part of that had to do with the fact that we're being fed this poison. And so one of the things we may want to do here is encourage those who are in front of the kids, because that's where it begins, to have more of a mandate to do some of the things that we're talking about, even in violation of some of the regulations, not so much the laws, because you get into trouble if you violate the laws openly, but the regulations and the conventions that are taken for granted. Try to expose kids to things that you otherwise would never have been exposed to along the lines we talked about. And so I thought that maybe if we could hear some of the suggestions that can be, channeled about this. Go ahead.
I just think that it starts with education. It can't be like the only thing on teachers and school administrators to feed Black history. You can't have an all-white media reporting stories on all Black. The people that are playing sports, and I have to go search out my truth. The movie Burn that is it's kind of based on the Haitian Revolution. It was all about slaves revolting and seizing the power as opposed to being given the power. The movement is gonna have to come from within the people. No one is gonna bring us, because if it was gonna happen, it would have happened after the Civil Rights Movement. The right laws would have came in so that we could have risen as a people. There shouldn't be it shouldn't be how it is now. The progress should have already come if it was gonna come magically.
Other comments, suggestions, way forward?
Our last panel discussion is going to be on April 14th, and it's about literature in South Africa, and it's going to be moderated by Stephen Klingman, and we're going to have Rita Barnard from the University of Pennsylvania, a scholar on South African literature, and Jackson Nida